Okay, so we're looking today at rearranging equations. You might have done it in maths with x's and y's. It's the same sort of thing in physics. We're going to use the power of opposites. So for example, the opposite of a plus is a negative. Okay, the opposite of a multiply is divide. Okay, so that'll make more sense hopefully in a minute. But for example, if we had 5 plus 3 equals 8, and we wanted to get the 5 on its own, we would do 5 equals 8 minus 3. Okay, so we've just used the opposite of plus 3 being minus 3, and we'll look at why that works in a sec. So the first type of thing you're going to be dealing with is just something simple like a equals b plus c. If we wanted to get b on its own, we would want to get rid of this plus c. So we take c from each side, and obviously c minus c cancels out, so then you're ending up with b equals a minus c. Similarly, if you want to get c on its own, you take a b from each side. Okay, so there's a couple here. So in the first example, you want to be making f the subject, and in the second example you want to make j the subject. Okay, so when we're talking about making the subject, okay, we're looking for a j equals here and an f equals up there. So if you pause the video, have a go at that, and we'll go through the answers. Okay, hopefully you paused it and are not just still watching. So we said we wanted f as the subject. Yes. So we've got a minus g here. We don't need to do anything to this side. So remember we said opposites. The opposite of minus g is plus g. So we'd have d plus e plus g equals f. Got f on its own. So that's actually all we need to do with that one. With this one we've got a minus j. We don't tend to like having minus our subject. So first thing we do is add a j to each side. Okay, so you got h plus I equals k plus m plus j, and then we're going to take a k and an m away from each side, so we end up with h plus I minus k minus m equals j. So there we go, we've rearranged it. We've got j equals there and an f equals there. Okay. Second type that we're going to look at is if we've got multiplication. So again, here we've got a equals b times c. We want to get b on its own, we've got to divide both sides by c. So the way that it works is the c's cancel out, and then we're just left with b equals a over c. Similarly, if we wanted the c on its own, we'd end up with c is a over b. Yeah. So as before, a couple for you to try. Again, try not to skip ahead. So pause the video now, and we're looking to make g the subject of this one and k the subject of this one. Okay, hopefully you paused there. So we want to get g on its own. So we've got an f and an e we need to get rid of. So we need to divide both sides by e and f. Okay, so we've got g on its own. Whereas on the next one, let's just remind ourselves, we need k on its own. Again, we're dividing by j, we're dividing by l. Okay, so we've got hi over jl equals k. Okay, if you're happier writing it as d divided by ef, then you can do, or even d divided by e divided by f. Okay, give you the same results. So a slightly different version of things. Instead of having a equals b times c, we're looking at dividing here. So if we want to get b on its own, that's relatively simple because we're going to use our rule of opposites. So we're going to, instead of our divide c, we're going to times by c. That gives us bc over c. Again, the c's cancel, so b equals ac. Okay, but if we want to get c on its own, we've got to bring it up to the other side first, okay, which is what we did here. So we would say that AC equals B, by multiplying both sides by C first, and then to get C on its own, we're dividing through by A. Okay, so it was 2 steps. We need to get C off the bottom, up to the top, and then we need to get rid of the A that was now there. Okay, so same sort of thing. Couple to try. So making E the subject is the slightly easier one, and then making F the subject slightly trickier. And then here, again, we're going to do K, then we're going to do L. Okay, so you should be getting the hang of this now. If you pause, give it a go. Okay, so we want to get E on its own. We've got to divide by F, so the opposite of that is times by F. So we do dF equals E. Nice and simple. E is on its own. And then from here, if we wanted to get F on its own, we've got to get rid of this times D. So we get E over D. Okay. Here we were looking at K and M, K and L. So to get K on its own, first thing, we're going to do it in 2 steps. We're going to times both sides by LM. It's JK. If you're happy with doing it in steps, that's fine. And then to get K on its own, we're going to bring the J down. So you're going to HILM, J, K. That was the first one. Second one, if we want to get L on its own, it's probably easier to go from this row here. So if we want to get L on its own, we've got to divide by I, divide by H, and divide by N. So we end up with I equals JK over H L M. Which is fine if you wanted to make I on its own, but of course you said L, so same process. L is K over H I M. Okay, keeping that over J, and then the last step we've got to bring that J up, so we end up with KJ over HIM equals L. Okay, bit of a mess there, but hopefully we get the idea. So, last one we're going to look at is if we've got a squared. So if we want to get C on its own, first thing is to get C squared on its own. That's similar to what we've just been doing, because we divide both sides by B. We're left with C squared equals A over B. And then we square root. So we square root after we've got the C squared on its own. You could do it the other way round, but it's just a bit messier and a bit trickier. Okay. So, again, last one, F on its own, G on its own, and K on its own. If you want to pause. Okay, so getting F on its own, so hopefully you can see it's just going to be D, E, over G squared. It's just similar to what we've been doing earlier, but to get G on its own, probably best off again getting G squared on its own, because you D, E over F, and then square rooting. Okay. The last one, to get K squared. Okay, so K squared is on the bottom again. So first thing we've got to bring K squared up to the top, so we get K squared H squared I equals J. Then we want to get K squared on its own, so we get K squared equals J over H squared I. And then the last thing, we just figure out square root. Okay, so that's it really. Tricky bit with the squared is always to sort of use the squared, sort the squareds out last. Apart from that, you should be fine. One last thing, it's sometimes easy to think about it in terms of moving diagonally. So for example, if you've got A equals B over C, if we want to get C, B on its own, we just move the C up to the top, because A is essentially A over 1. Okay. Similarly, if we then wanted to get the C on its own, then these are both over 1. So then the A would come down the bottom. So you end up with C equals B over A. Okay, so you might find that a useful way of doing things, this diagonal move. You might not, we'll give it a go.